Now, the first thing, of course, is to note that this is now the new conventional wisdom in the field of ethnicity and nationalism. It is extremely influential. It is now the mainstream. And the key works, the most influential, of course, is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. But there are others that I have listed here. David Layton, a political scientist at Stanford. Linda Colley, a historian of Britain, now I think at Princeton. Eugene Weber, Peasants into Frenchmen, historian of France, I think at the University of Washington, Seattle. Mahmoud Mamdani at Columbia, a scholar of Africa. Gyanendra Pandey, whose book Construction of Communalism in Colonial North India, all historians read now, historians of India. And Partha Chatterjee, a political scientist who produced a very influential piece of scholarship, nationalist thought in the colonial world. What is the central claim? The central claim of constructivism is our ethnic and national identities are constructs of the modern epoch. They are neither ancient nor primordial. Neither ancient nor primordial. Now, this particular claim, and we'll see how the details of the claim in a moment, this particular claim is relatively straightforward for national identities across many fields of inquiry now. It is believed, there is consensus on the proposition that nations were born with the rise of the industrial age. Nations are a modern phenomenon. So whether Nehru says in Discovery of India that India is an ancient nation, or Hindu nationalist narratives say that India is an ancient nation, that is not, from the perspective of scholarship, technically correct. They might have been civilizations, but not nations. Nations are modern constructs. And pre-modern political communities were what? Took the form of city-states or empires, but not nations. What would be the difference between empires and nations? So empires are conquered territories, and some emperors do develop legitimacy, right? But they are not nations. You might want to add that nations are, even when you have an authoritarian nation, the idea of a nation is a horizontal idea. It has horizontality about it, which is to say masses feel that they are part of the community, even when they don't have the right to vote. Right? They're part of the community, which is not how empires functioned. And city-states you've had always in history, and city-states, either the units are very small, and some city-states today could be nations, such as Singapore. But city-states on the whole were not designed as nations. The key here is the idea of conquest or the idea of mass participation or mass identification. Will not always be participation, mass identification with the political movement. Now, so if we believe that nations were born in the modern times and not in pre-modern times, then this claim that our national identities are constructs of the modern epoch is a straightforward claim. But what about our ethnic identities? The argument is also made with respect to them. Ethnic as to be separated from national identities. There are many nations in the world which are multi-ethnic. Right? In some nations, of course, have only one ethnicity, but there are very few of them now, in the contemporary times. So the claim is, the constructivist claim is not that there were no Turks, Han Chinese, Tibetans, Zulus, Scots, Hindus in pre-modern times. That's not the claim. The claim is that in pre-modern times, mass identities were locally or regionally based. Only some identities, for example, the aristocratic identity or the ecclesiastical identity, were extra-local or extra-regional. Mass identities, the claim is, were local. The spatial units within which you experienced or you expressed your identity, that spatial unit was highly localized. Modernity transformed the meaning of ethnic identities by bringing the masses into a vastly expanded framework of consciousness and meaning. To be a Hindu today is very different from being a Hindu in the 14th century. To be a Muslim today is very different from being a Muslim when Muhammad was still alive. That's the point. There were always Tibetans, there were always Han Chinese, but those terms have very different meanings today. And so that's the key idea here. Participation of the masses into a vastly expanded framework of consciousness and meanings. Aristocrats had extra local networks and extra local communities. Ecclesiastical communities could be extra local, larger. So this is the idea of religious communities could be larger. Yes, to be a Hindu today is very different from being a Hindu in the 6th century. Nonetheless, there were some religious networks that were available. Hinduism did not have an ecclesiastical hierarchy like Catholicism. Never, right? So the Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy meant that there was a vast network and a large number of people available for that hierarchy. Right? And so you could have that, but otherwise masses were not did not express themselves beyond their local spatial units. So, how did this all come? If this is all true, what transformed, there was a question yesterday, what transformed human consciousness or political consciousness? What mechanisms transformed pre-modern political consciousness to modern political consciousness, of which national consciousness is a very important, one of the most important parts. Right? So the literature proposes 3 mechanisms: technological, ideational, and in the former colonies, the impact of colonial practices and colonial rule, leading to the formation of these identities. So the first is technological, and that is the core of Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson's widely read text. And the claim is that national consciousness or national identities or nationalism were intimately connected to the rise of print capitalism, the arrival of the printing press and capitalism. What would the printing press do? It's worth asking. And when the printing press is connected to capitalism, that is to say, the printers would like to sell more and more and more to make profits, right? What would it do to consciousness? Why is this mechanism so important to the argument? So this is connected to several things. First of all, the rise of newspapers, right? Newspapers and the ideas they began to communicate, the ideas that went beyond the local spatial unit. Ideas spreading beyond that through newspapers. Right? Then you have another important part of the argument. The boundaries of the political communities typically depended on the spread of the vernacular and decline of truth languages, Latin or Sanskrit. So, the first available text in English, is English the vernacular or the truth language for England? A vernacular. It was a vernacular, right? Before English rose to before English rose, let's say, before English rose, what did you, when you went to Oxford or Cambridge, what was your medium of instruction? Latin. How many people could read Latin? Very few. How many could read Sanskrit, in which truth existed? The idea was Latin had truth in it. Sanskrit text would have truth embodied in it. Right? So, when did Shakespeare write? Shakespeare is the first great English language, English literature. 1562, I think, is the birth. We can check. 1607, 1608, or 1617 is the death, right? The next big English writer is Milton. He comes after Shakespeare, right? So the claim is that's the beginning. You have a vernacular in which the newspaper is written, in which books are being written, and finally, the English translation of Bible is when? Also in the 17th century. Otherwise, the Bible was in what language? Latin. Right? That's another reason why it was called truth language, right? The Bible was in Latin. So you have vernacularization of Bible also. This particular process in the 17th century then begins to generate an expanded framework of meanings and consciousness beyond the local spatial unit. Right? The claim, therefore, is that without the vernacular, without the newspaper, you would not have nationalism. It doesn't spread by word of mouth, is the claim. Mechanism 2, we have gone through, we can quickly, there's a lot here, but we can quickly go through this. Ideational, this invokes the idea that Charles Taylor proposed, and we have discussed. In pre-modern times, one's identity, who am I, was given by one's place in the traditional social structure. People accepted ascriptive social hierarchies. In pre-modern times, the notion of honor reserved only for a few marked human relations between people of different ranks. Modernity has introduced us to the notion of dignity, to which all, regardless of rank, are entitled. That's how you feel. That's what you believe. Our identity is, to quote this famous sentence, famous passage once again, partly shaped by recognition or its absence, often by misrecognition of others, and so a person or groups of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining, demeaning, or contemptible picture of themselves. Non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict harm and can be a form of oppression, imprisoning someone in a false, distorted, reduced mode of being, unquote. Though acceptable, internalized in the past, much of ethnic and national assertion in the modern world is about resisting such confining, demeaning, or contemptible pictures that the dominant groups, through colonial rulers or state bureaucracies, have often relayed to the subordinate groups. The key word here is dignity, not material self-interest. Orientalism argument goes in this direction by Edward Said. Please note that I have encountered many cases where Dalits gave their children names such as Gandu. Yes, they had internalized this. Of course, there will be fewer such cases now. Right? There are fewer such names. You look at the names, the way Dalit names are changing today. Right? The term Negro is not acceptable, nigger, because it's demeaning. Right? The term Achut is not acceptable. It's demeaning. Even Harijan is not acceptable anymore. Gandhi's term is not acceptable. It's called demeaning. So the idea here is that you have the birth of, in the modern times, the birth of the notion of dignity, to which all human beings are entitled. Honor may be for just a few, but dignity everyone has. Right? This is the ideational development in modern times. That's a second mechanism through which you get these identities, either national or ethnic or both. And the third is colonial practices. They're famous. Indian scholars have contributed a lot to this streams of scholarship, but also, as you would expect, there would be a lot from Africa too. The most recently decolonized continents are Africa and Asia. Latin America was decolonized in early 19th century. Some of that work that is appearing in Latin America now is seriously influenced by what scholars of Asia and Africa are doing. And here are some interesting examples of that. David Layton wrote a famous book about Yoruba land in Nigeria. The Yorubas, in Yoruba politics in Nigeria, religious cleavage is missing, even though both Islam and Christianity dominated the religious landscape. People are going to mosques, people are going to churches, but there is no religious cleavage in politics. Politics is driven by tribal affiliations. Why would that be so? Why tribe is the master cleavage, not religion, even though religion is practiced? The answer, as he traced the possible answer, he went all the way back to the British colonial rule in Nigeria. The British did not allow religion to be the basis of politics in Yoruba land, electing instead to emphasize tribal cleavages. By the time they left, the tribal cleavages were so deeply institutionalized that they became the political common sense of Yoruba politics. You practice Christianity, you practice Islam, but you don't let religion define political conduct. Right? And this deeply institutionalized British colonial practices. Partha Chatterjee, our own Partha Chatterjee, the images in the 1986 book, the images of Indians British rulers created and propagated once they conquered India were so demeaning that they led to the development of nationalism in India in the end. So he goes through how Gandhi is arguing, he goes through how Nehru is arguing. It starts with Raja Ram Mohan Roy. There are 4, I think, in the nationalist thought, colonial world and colonial rule and nationalist thought, the 1986 book. Right? Another example of how colonial practices shaped identities is in the political history of India, modern India, is undoubtedly separate electorates. Ashish Nandi has a very interesting, he is very well known for pulling out some interesting facts and narratives. And that's how clinical psychology works, actually. That's the method they use. Narratives and biographies are extremely important for them. He reports in one of his articles, in 1911, if you look at 1911 census, thousands of people, if not millions, could be millions, right, were willing, when asked by the census operator, are you Hindu or Muslim? The answer was, we are Hindu-Muslim. Now, I'm not saying all 25% of Muslim minority, 25% of India at that time, 1911 would be about 200 million. That 50 million people said that. No. Or 100 million people. But a sufficiently large number of people did not think that these were two separate categories. In the literature on constructivism, the census plays a very big role. Census was instituted in most societies, or in many societies, by roughly 1861, 1871, 1881. What is your guess about why the census plays such an important role in constructivist accounts of identity formation? What does the Ashish Nandi example illustrate? That categories had real consequences. They were not abstract concepts. Categories supported by power. Right? Categories supported by power had real world, material, political consequences. Whatever the British thought about why, there is some very interesting work on this now. Why did they think of some categories and not some other categories? This is also, there's burgeoning literature in American politics. Why did American census think of black as connected to how many drops of blood? 1/16, 1/8, etc., right? so they had their own understanding of how to categorize. So there's something going on there. It's not, category construction was not, in other words, not always malintentioned. There was a certain worldview they had in mind about how Indians were to be categorized. Right? Now, that was not necessarily aimed at divide and rule, though separate elections, we can argue, were perhaps almost certainly, if not entirely certainly, almost certainly aimed at that. But the census was a reflection of how they understood India. But once they forced people to say, imagine another conversation. This is a famous example. So they came with the northern Varna system. And the census operator would go to Chettiars in Madras presidency and say, what are you? Say, we are Chettiars. What do you do? We do this. But you're Vaishya. You're business people. You're Vaishya. The Chettiar household head say, what is Vaishya? No, we're not Vaishya. We're Chettiars. Right? You see the point here? So you had, there are certain concepts or ideas which are not understood as real by human beings, but those categories got imposed, right? So, and because those categories were supported by power, and then certain kinds of incentives or certain allocation of resources or allocation of offices, right? That was connected to those categories. The claim that Ashish Nandi makes, which should be investigated further, that and a lot of people believe in it. Shrita Kaviraj has made this argument too, that in early 19th century India, or even 1850s and 1860s before census was introduced, identities were very plastic. There was a certain plasticity. Plastic meaning plasticity about identities. You could see yourself as Hindu and Muslim and Christian in some places. These were not categories which were clearly separable in a watertight way. But the census made them watertight, or the colonial practice such as separate electorates created a Muslim identity which was not there earlier. Not that Muslims were not there, but that kind of identity was not there. Right? So remember the claim. It's not that in pre-modern times there were no Hutus, Muslims, and Han Chinese and Tibetans. No. But the meaning is very different now. Separate electorates created a Muslim political community. There was not a Muslim political community in India, certainly not an all-India Muslim community, which began to emerge as a result of this. Right? So the census, these are colonial practices, institutionalization of tribal cleavages, lasting, demeaning images. This is sort of connected to the second point also. This is not just an illustration of a point which is also, connected to the notion of dignity. But this is separate electorates and the census. They are not necessarily connected to the notion of dignity. These are categories, colonial categories supported by colonial power, creating new forms of consciousness. That's the claim. All right. This will appear tomorrow as well. Is that modern societies, either in and of themselves or because of colonial rule, created master narratives. Master narratives are stories you tell about the basic issues in society on which you can mobilize. Right? These are stories. So the master narrative of America would undoubtedly have three things. Equality, freedom, and race. Master narrative of Indian politics has had religion and caste. Right? So the claim is that structures of power, whether colonial or not, create master narratives about the basic issues of society. Those master narratives are supported by institutions of power also. Therefore, they become a reality. People begin to believe them. Prejudices can emerge in other ways as well, but supported by institutions of power. So Indians were told that India's basic problem is Hindus and Muslims and caste. Right? Now, whether it was really the issue or this is what the colonial masters said, therefore we began to believe, well, there could be debate on that. Right? But this was the master narrative. Right? Now, the claim is, the idea of conflict in constructivist literature is that once these master narratives are available, then local political entrepreneurs, they plug almost anything into these master narratives. So this is strategic and instrumental use of master narrative for your purposes. So in a famous book by Stathis Kalevas, he argues that there are always master narratives in civil wars about grievances. There are big narratives about grievances, about how the colonial masters handle the colonial subjects, or how Brahmins maltreated the Dalits, or how Hindus maltreated the Muslims, or vice versa, how Mughal ruled, etc. And while those narratives exist, for your own self-interest, you could plug what is going on in your society or in your local unit into those narratives and turn something which is very self-interested into something grander. This is the idea. The problem is, this master narrative does not explain the patterns of violence. It turns out that violence, not only in India, in my book 10 years ago I argued that 8 cities of India account for 50% of all deaths in Hindu-Muslim riots. This is not, there might be Hindu-Muslim prejudice everywhere in India. I have not studied that. I am prepared to believe that that may be true. But violence is not an all-India phenomenon. Rioting is not an all-India phenomenon. Prejudice may be. And these are 2 different categories. Right? And 8, so Indonesia I've studied. There is, and in these 8 cities of India, we'll discuss them on the 4th day in detail, only 6% of India lives. It's that concentrated. Then Indonesia we studied, and we have 20 districts, I think, 15 districts accounting for about 8% of the population, having something like 80% of deaths. Even more concentrated than India. United States of America had a lot of racial violence in the 1960s. 3 cities, Newark, New Jersey, LA, California, and Detroit, Michigan, accounted for, we have not done the exact numbers, but a very large proportion of violence. Why do we, if this is simply another version of instrumentalism, why use this big term? Why have a whole tradition? The new mainstream tradition in the field of ethnic conflict, if not ethnicity. Conflict, as you said, there's a problem here about conflict. Or violence at least. Identity formation, it dominates the way we think about it. What's the difference, if any? This is from my chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Politics. Constructivism is not about the radical short-run fluidity of identities. It's about long-run formation and consequent stickiness of identities. In Anderson's case, the argument is epochal. He discusses how the birth of print capitalism in modern times created national identities. Eugene Weber shows how peasants were turned into Frenchmen over more than a century after the French Revolution. Colley's argument is about how Britishness emerged out of Englishness, Scottishness, and Welshness for over more than a century, and how the presence of France as a Catholic enemy and a colonial empire especially blunted the historically rooted intensity of English-Scottish rivalries. Each of these constructivist scholars demonstrates how new identities came about, but it does not follow that these new identities were radically fluid and could be easily changed depending on interests. Constructivism is basically about the long-run stickiness, instrumentalism about short-run fluidity. While equally opposed to essentialism, they are fundamentally different in their assumptions, explanatory ambition, and methodological impulse. That's it. So the fact that something is constructed does not mean that it's not genuinely believed. It's internalized. The instrumentalist scholar is not talking about, instrumentalist view is not talking about that. It basically says that identity is simply a mask for a deeper core of interest. Identity has no value of its own. It's a mask for a deeper core, which is either political or economic. Constructivism is saying, yes, the identities are constructed, but they are not a mask. They are genuinely internalized and believed in. Now, because they are believed in and genuinely internalized, you can have an instrumentalist game by somebody else. But emergence of identity, these long-run identities, they have nothing to do with instrumentalism per se. Right? This is the idea. Instrumentalism, the constructivists take identities seriously and believe that we internalize them and we indeed become Muslims and Hindus and Kashmiris and Kannadigas. Right? And think that statement about us, that we are Kannadigas or we are Muslims, is of great value and has tremendous meaning. It's not a mask. For some it may be. But on the whole, that's not what they're saying. It's not a mask. Right? The fact that it's believed in by so many may allow some to play the instrumental game. It's not, but constructivism itself is not instrumentalism. Hence the separation.